Hey everyone. For chapter two is all about kind of the history of private sector labor relations. So basically private companies or anybody who works for those types of organizations. So where in chapter three it's more public. So for people who work for the government, state, federal, things along those lines. But for chapter two, we're focusing on private sector labor relations, and there's really kind of two main parts that I want you to know for chapter two. One is the history, and one is the laws. So for history, I think it's table 2.1 in chapter two really summarizes, from the earliest days in the colonies all the way almost to modern day, of what has happened. And there's a lot of information in there. Of course, I certainly don't expect you to memorize, from colonial times to now and to know every little detail. But there are a couple things that I think are very important that I do want you to pay attention to. One, some of the early strikes and things. So the Haymarket Square riot, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike, those three specific things. Make sure you study those and you know what resulted, what caused them, and how did they help kind of create or set up the movement towards modern labor recognition. So the Haymarket, the Pullman, and the Homestead. Make sure you study those, pretty quickly or pretty carefully, and know what those stand for. And there's a couple, your book talks about a couple of really early influences in labor law: Eugene Debs and Samuel Gompers. So make sure you know who those two individuals were and what they did and how they contributed, kind of to the early labor movement specifically. And then, your book also talks about, I'm sure a lot of you now have heard of the AFL-CIO, one of the largest labor organizations in the country. Well, they started off as different organizations, and eventually they would merge into one organization. But the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, one of the earliest, national labor organizations. Make sure you know about the AFL, as well as their counterpart, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Read about how they developed, what they were designed to do, and how they kind of created, early labor movement, and it emerged into what it is today. So, and again, those two, that a lot of history will kind of help you in determining what is important in the early labor movement. And those kind of led us into the second part of what I want you to know for chapter two, which is about the laws. And the book talks about several different laws, but there's some that I definitely want you to focus on. First is the Clayton Act. This is basically one of the earliest laws that basically allowed for lawful union activity. It kind of prevented, the courts from for a company going to a court and automatically asking for an injunction against them to do that. Well, the Clayton Act kind of made that very, very limited, essentially. So it was a very important early law. The Norris Laguardia Act is another really important, and that kind of took it a step further, and that restricted, federal courts from most jurisdictions. Really, because of the Clayton Act and the Norris Laguardia Act, usually the only time, courts can really get involved is to protect law and order. So if there's, a big, I'll call it brawl, or there's setting fires and really a lot of damage, things along those lines, or people are getting beat up or things along those lines, then they might be able to issue an injunction. But outside of those, those two laws protected unions from being able to organize and do the things that unions usually do. So again, very, very important law. And then maybe the most important labor law, it's the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act. You can call it either one. That basically was the law that kind of created union rights, private sector rights, if you will. The ability to bargain in good faith, to negotiate for wages and terms and conditions of employment. It's kind of the law that set all this into motion, essentially. So, it created the National Labor Relations Board, that we kind of mentioned in chapter one. So again, very important to know the Clayton Act, the Norris LaGuardia Act, and the Wagner Act as kind of the three biggest laws as relates to the labor unions. A couple other laws that I think are just as equally important, but for different reasons. One, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Your book talks about that a lot. That's the law that it was kind of designed originally to limit child labor, so that children under a certain age can only work so many hours a week. But in modern times, we know the FLSA now because it's the law that says if you work more than 40 hours in a week, that you get overtime, you get time and a half. So it does a lot of different things. So make sure you pay very close attention to what the Fair Labor Standards Act does, also known as the FLSA. And taking that a step further, you also want to know. And again, we did an assignment in our module 2. We talked about the Taft-Hartley Act and the Landrum-Griffin Act. Make sure you read in your textbook more details and know what the Taft-Hartley amendments did and what the Landrum-Griffin Act was designed to do. So, again, I know that's a lot of information, a lot of laws, and a lot of details for Chapter 2, but again, so much of what we know about unions today and throughout labor history comes out of the details that we read in Chapter 2. So again, if you, again, please read the whole chapter, but if you focus on those main points, that will do a good job of covering what I want you to know for Chapter 2. Thanks, everyone.